The leash went taut, then slack, then taut again, not because the dog was fighting the leash but because it kept looking back at the same spot along the fence line, at the same man, every single time. Lena had pulled reluctant dogs into transport crates 100 times. She had never had one plant all 90 pounds of itself against a stranger's leg like it had grown roots there. The man didn't reach for the dog. He didn't seem to notice it was there. He was staring at his own hands like he was trying to remember what they were for. "Whistle," Lena said, low, the way you'd talk to a dog about to make a decision it couldn't take back. "Come on, buddy, not this again." The German Shepherd mix didn't growl. It didn't need to. It just sat down against the man's leg, 90 pounds of dead weight, and looked up at him with an expression Lena had no training manual for. The man on the other side of the chain link finally glanced down. He looked at the dog the way you'd look at a word on the tip of your tongue, close, almost there, gone again. Then he looked back at his hands. Lena crouched, slipped 2 fingers under Whistle's collar, and pulled gently. The dog didn't budge. She pulled harder. Whistle's paws dug into the gravel, and a sound came out of him that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine, something in between, something that sounded almost like a question. "Okay," she said, letting go. "Okay, okay." She straightened up and looked at the man properly for the first time. 60-something, maybe older. A green field jacket gone soft and colorless at the elbows. A canvas bag over one shoulder, the strap replaced with a length of paracord. He had the look of someone who'd learned, a long time ago, how to stand in a way that took up as little space as possible. "Sir," Lena said, "do you know this dog?" The man's eyes came up slow, like they had to travel a long way to get to her face. "No," he said, quiet, careful, like he was testing the ground before he put weight on it. "No, ma'am, I don't think so. He's been coming to this fence 3 times this week, always right when you walk by. I walk by a lot of things. It wasn't rude. It wasn't much of anything, just a fact, delivered flat." He shifted the canvas bag and looked down at the dog one more time, and for a second something flickered across his face, a thought that almost surfaced and then sank again before he could catch it. "I should go," the man said. He walked. Whistle didn't follow, couldn't, not through 50 feet of chain link, but he stood at the fence and watched every step, ears up, tail low and still, until the man turned the corner by the bus shelter and was gone. Lena wrote it down in the intake log that night, in the margin where she kept the things that didn't fit anywhere else. Whistle, fence behavior, 3rd time this week, unknown male, elderly, unhoused presumed, no aggression, watches until subject out of sight. Flag for review. She didn't know yet what she was flagging. She just knew that in 4 years working the shelter's back kennels, she had never once seen a dog behave like it was keeping a promise. 3 blocks away, Emery Falk walked past the bus shelter without stopping, the way he walked past most things now, carefully, like the sidewalk might shift under him if he trusted it too much. He couldn't have said, if you'd asked him right then, why his right hand had curled into a shape it hadn't held in years, fingers slightly spread, palm angled down, waiting to rest on something that wasn't there. He got to his truck a little after 6. Old Ford, the color of a bruise gone yellow-green, parked in the same gravel turnout behind the park where he'd parked it for 3 years running. He climbed in, pulled the door shut with the 2-handed motion the latch required now, and sat a while without turning the key. His hand was still curled that way. He looked at it like it belonged to someone else. Somewhere behind him, past the trees, past the fence he hadn't noticed he'd walked beside, a dog he didn't remember meeting was pacing the length of his kennel run, nose to the chain link, waiting for a man who had already forgotten he'd been there. Emery Falk woke most mornings the same way, not confused, exactly, but not certain either, lying still in the truck bed with his eyes open, running through a short list of facts until they held together. His name, the year, roughly, that the truck was his, that he was 70 years old, and there was a war he'd been in a long time ago, that he remembered better than yesterday. Yesterday was the part that gave him trouble. He got up, folded the blanket the way he always folded it, 3 times lengthwise, and climbed out into a morning that smelled like wet asphalt. The gas station on the corner of 9th sold day-old bread and dented cans at half price, and the woman behind the counter knew him well enough to ring him up without asking questions, which he was grateful for, in a way he never said out loud. "Morning, hun," she said. "You want the coffee too?" "Please, you already had one. I made it for you 20 minutes ago. You were sitting right there." She nodded at the plastic chair by the window. He looked at the chair. He looked at his hands, empty. "Did I?" "You did," she said it kindly. "No judgment in it. You want another?" "No, thank you." He paid for the bread and the can of soup and walked out into the light, and somewhere between the door and the sidewalk, the fact of the coffee slid loose from wherever he'd been keeping it and was gone. He didn't panic anymore. That had stopped happening around year 2, when a doctor at the VA clinic had finally put a name to it, a name involving the word blast and the word residual, and a scan that showed in gray and white a scattering of small dark spots like a windshield after gravel had hit it. Old damage. Not getting worse, not getting better, the kind of injury that didn't heal so much as it settled, the way a house settles, cracks appearing in walls that used to be straight. The mobile VA nurse came through the park on Thursdays in a van with a fold-down step, and Emery sat on the same bench he always sat on and let her take his blood pressure and shine a light in his eyes. "Same as last time," she said, meaning it kindly. "Memory's still mostly short range. Long stuff's intact?" "Long stuff's fine," Emery said. He'd learned the shape of his own condition the way you learn the shape of a scar, the years before the blast sat in him whole and vivid, footlockers and formation lines and a friend's laugh he could still hear exactly, note for note. It was the last 5 years that had holes in them, some days the last 5 hours. "You eating okay?" "I'm fine. You said that last time too." It was true then as well. She smiled, wrote something on her clipboard, and didn't push. She never pushed. He liked her for that, though he wouldn't have been able to say her name if you'd asked him the next morning. That night, parked in his usual spot, with the last of the daylight going purple over the tree line, Emery reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a small tin box with a dented corner. Inside, there was a photograph, a Polaroid, the kind with the white border, the image gone soft and yellow at the edges. 2 men in fatigues, younger than he could picture himself ever having been, standing in front of a chain-link fence with a dog between them. The dog's face was blurred, mid-turn. One of the men had his hand resting on its head. He didn't recognize either man's face. Something in his chest recognized the fence. He turned the photo over, nothing written on the back. He turned it face up again and looked at it a long moment, the way he'd learned to look at things that felt important without being sure why, patient, unhurried, waiting to see if the feeling would resolve into a memory or just stay a feeling. It stayed a feeling. He put it back in the tin and closed the lid and sat a while longer in the dark with his hand resting on top of it. 2 days later, walking the long way back from the clinic, he passed a woman walking a small terrier on the opposite sidewalk. The terrier yapped at something, strained its leash, and without thinking, without any thought at all, the words simply arriving in his mouth already formed, Emery said, quiet, almost under his breath, "Steady, down." The terrier, 20 feet away, stopped pulling and sat. Emery stopped walking. The woman glanced over, surprised, and gave him an odd half-smile before tugging her dog on down the block. Emery stood on the sidewalk, with his heart going harder than the moment seemed to call for, staring at the 2 words that had just come out of him like they'd been sitting loaded in his mouth for years, waiting for the right shape of moment to fire. He didn't know where they'd come from. He didn't know any dogs. He was fairly sure, if you'd asked him that morning, that he'd say he'd never trained one in his life. He walked the rest of the way to the truck slower than usual, turning the 2 words over like the photograph, looking for the edge where the feeling might tip into memory. It didn't tip, it just sat there, warm and unexplained, the whole rest of the evening, the way a bruise sits under the skin, not painful exactly, just present. The next morning, he took the long way to the corner store again, some current he couldn't name pulling him a half block out of his way, past a stretch of chain-link fence he had no memory of ever walking beside before. A dog was already there, sitting square in the middle of its kennel run, facing the fence, tail still, not wagging, just waiting, the way you wait for a bus you're certain is coming. It didn't bark, it just watched, and Emery stopped walking without meaning to. By the second week, it had stopped feeling like an accident. Emery told himself it hadn't, that he was only sitting on the low concrete wall across from the shelter fence because it was quiet there, because the traffic noise from the avenue thinned out to almost nothing behind the tree line, because a man needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a bus bench with a sign telling him not to lie down. All of that was true. None of it explained why he'd started arriving at the same hour every day, or why some part of him relaxed the moment he came around the corner and saw the dog already waiting. Whistle would be there before him more often than not now, sitting, not pacing, angled toward the spot on the fence where Emery usually stopped, as if he'd learned to read the man's arrival the way you'd read a clock. Lena watched it happen on the security feed 3 nights running, propped at her desk with a cup of coffee gone cold, the grainy black and white footage looping the same 20 minutes over and over. Man arrives, dog is already sitting, man sits on the low wall outside the fence. Dog lies down on the inside, close as the chain link allows, and doesn't move again until the man leaves. No barking, no pacing, no frantic fence jumping like some of the dogs did when a person they liked showed up. Just a stillness in Whistle that Lena had never once seen from him in a kennel, not with the volunteers, not with the other staff, not even with her, and she was the one who fed him twice a day. She started a folder. She didn't tell anyone why yet, mostly because she didn't have a why to give them, just 3 nights of footage and a feeling she couldn't file under any of the shelter's official categories. She'd worked with plenty of dogs who bonded fast and hard to whoever showed them kindness first. That wasn't unusual, that was half the job. What was unusual was the shape of it. Whistle wasn't seeking Emery's attention, he wasn't performing for treats or affection. He was simply present, the way a sentry is present, the way something stands guard over a door it's been told never to leave. On the 4th night, crouched by the kennel doing evening rounds, she noticed something she'd missed a dozen times before, a strip of leather half hidden under Whistle's collar, worn thin, with a small metal tag threaded onto it that wasn't the shelter's intake tag. She turned it gently between 2 fingers. The engraving had worn down to almost nothing, a few scratched lines that might have been letters once, might have been a name, might have been anything. She couldn't make out more than a curve and what could have been the tail of a Y. "Where'd you get this?" she murmured. Whistle leaned his head into her hand, patient, uninterested in the question. She made a note to ask the shelter's vet about it in the morning, then got pulled into an intake emergency, 2 strays and a surrendered litter, all arriving within an hour of each other, and the tag slipped down her list of things to chase, the way things did in a shelter that never had enough hands for the hours it needed. It was 3 days later, a warm evening with the light going long and gold across the gravel lot, that Emery did something he hadn't done in longer than he could reliably say. He'd been sitting on the wall as usual, Whistle lying just inside the fence, both of them still in that way they'd fallen into without discussing it, because dogs didn't discuss things, and Emery had stopped discussing much of anything with anyone in longer than he liked to think about. But that evening, without deciding to, without any thought arriving first to tell his body what it was about to do, Emery reached his hand up and through a gap in the chain link. It wasn't a big gesture, just fingers, extended, hovering a few inches inside the fence line. Whistle was on his feet before the hand finished moving. He crossed the run in 3 strides and pressed his head directly into Emery's open palm, not nuzzling, not sniffing first, the way a strange dog would. He simply arrived there, like the hand was a place he already knew, and went still. Emery's fingers closed. His hand found the spot behind the dog's left ear and settled into a light rhythmic pressure, thumb moving in a small circle, index and middle finger tucked just under the base of the ear where the fur went short and soft, a motion so specific, so exact, that it could not have been the first time his hand had made it. He felt his own fingers doing it before he understood that he was choosing to. It was the same feeling as the 2 words on the sidewalk, steady, down, a door in him opening onto a room he didn't remember building, furniture already arranged, waiting. Whistle leaned his full weight into the touch and let out a long breath through his nose, the kind of breath that sounds like something finally being allowed to happen. Emery sat very still. His chest was tight, breath shallow, throat working around something he couldn't swallow down. He didn't move his hand. He didn't see Lena come around the side of the intake building, didn't see her stop mid-stride at the side of it, the dog who fought the leash, who'd cost 3 volunteers their patience trying to crate him, standing utterly calm with his head pinned under a stranger's hand, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She had her phone half raised to take a photo for the folder before she thought better of it and just watched instead, not wanting to be the thing that broke the moment. She was still standing there when Deputy Warden Halsey's assistant jogged over from the main building, out of breath, holding a clipboard like it weighed something. "Lena, sorry, hate to pull you off whatever this is, but that run's flagged for transfer eval. He snapped a warning at 2 crate attempts this week. That's automatic escalation. If he doesn't pass the next behavioral check, he's on the list for the regional facility. Halsey wants it done by Friday." Lena's eyes went from the clipboard to the fence, to the calm, quiet weight of Whistle's head resting under a stranger's palm, to the man himself, who hadn't even looked up, who seemed to have no idea that a piece of paper somewhere had already started deciding this dog's future without either of them in the room. "Friday," she repeated. "Friday," the assistant said, already jogging back the way he'd come. Lena looked down at the folder tucked under her arm, 3 nights of footage, a worn leather tag with no readable name, and now this, and understood, with a small cold drop in her stomach, that whatever she was looking at, she didn't have much time left to figure it out. The transfer attempt happened on a Tuesday morning, and it did not go the way the shelter's standard procedure said it should. 2 staff members eased into Whistle's run with a slip lead and a pocket of treats, moving the way you're trained to move around a dog you don't fully trust, slow, sideways, no direct eye contact. Whistle was lying against the back wall of the run when they came in, and by the time the lead touched his collar, he was already a different animal. The growl came from somewhere low in his chest, a sound with weight to it, and when the younger of the 2 staff reached for his harness, he spun and snapped at the air an inch from her wrist. Not a bite. A warning, precise and controlled, the kind of thing a well-trained dog does when it wants you to understand something without actually hurting you. She pulled back anyway, heart going, and the older staffer called it, "No transfer today, log the incident, try again tomorrow, with sedation protocol on standby." Lena heard about it before she saw it. From the noise carrying clear across the yard, Whistle's bark had a pitch to it she'd never heard from him, high and frantic, hitting the chain link hard enough to rattle it. She was halfway across the lot when the sound cut off completely, mid-bark, like someone had switched it off. She stopped, listened, nothing. By the time she reached the run, Whistle was standing dead still at the fence, ears forward, nose working the air, and it took her a second to place what had changed. Then she heard it too, faint, from the direction of the main gate, a voice. Low, unhurried, not even loud enough to carry the words, just the shape of a man talking to no one in particular as he walked. Whistle hadn't seen him yet. Couldn't have. The gate was around the corner of the intake building, out of any line of sight the kennel run offered. He'd stopped reacting to the sound of a voice he recognized before his eyes had any part in it at all. Lena stood there with her clipboard forgotten at her side and felt the cold drop in her stomach turn into something closer to certainty. This wasn't fence-line loneliness. This wasn't a stray dog latching onto the first kind face it found. Something underneath this ran a lot deeper than 3 weeks, and she was starting to feel a little foolish for how long it had taken her to admit that to herself. 4 years of intake logs, of behavior sheets, of dogs who bonded to whoever fed them first, and she had never once seen a dog place a voice before it placed a face. She met Emery at the gate before he'd even reached the wall he usually sat on. Mr. She realized she didn't actually know his name, only what she'd guessed from watching him for 3 weeks. "Sir, do you have a minute?" He looked at her the way he looked at most things that weren't the dog. Carefully, a little braced, like conversation was a door he wasn't sure led anywhere good. "I don't want any trouble," he said. "You're not in trouble. I'm Lena. I work here." She held out a hand. He looked at it for a second before shaking it, his grip careful, like he wasn't sure how hard was too hard. "Can I ask your name?" "Emery." A pause. "Falk." "Emery. Whistle, that's the dog's name, the one that comes to the fence for you. He had a rough morning. Staff tried to move him, and he wouldn't have it. Then you showed up, or, she corrected herself, watching his face, your voice showed up, before you'd even turned the corner, and he went completely calm, just like that. Emery's jaw worked for a second. I don't know why he does that. Neither do I, that's kind of the problem. She glanced back toward the run, where Whistle was now lying pressed against the fence closest to the gate, watching them both. Can I ask, have you ever owned a dog, trained one, maybe, a while back? The question landed somewhere in him that Lena couldn't see the shape of, but she watched it land, a small flinch, quickly smoothed over, the look of a man patting down his own pockets for something he was fairly sure wasn't there. I don't think so, he said. I don't. He stopped. Started again, quieter. There's a lot I don't remember clearly, the last handful of years, mostly. Before that, I remember fine. It's recent things that don't stay. Lena hadn't expected that. She adjusted, gently. Is that from, VA calls it a residual injury. I call it what it is. He said it without self-pity, the flat delivery of a man who'd explained this enough times that the explaining itself had gone numb. I don't remember training any dog. I don't remember much from before I ended up living the way I do now. If Whistle knows me from somewhere, I couldn't tell you where. But your hands seem to know something. He looked down at them, the same way he had in the truck 3 weeks earlier. Yeah, he said, they do that sometimes. I'll be reaching for a cup and my fingers already know how heavy it's supposed to be before I've even touched it. Or I'll be walking somewhere and my feet take a turn I didn't decide to take. I've stopped trying to make sense of it most days. It's just how things are now. You learn to live alongside a body that keeps its own secrets. A much bigger conversation was sitting just behind this one, too large to have standing at a gate with a clipboard under her arm. Would you be willing to come in? Not for anything official, I just want to try something. Whistle's on a short clock with the shelter's transfer policy, and I think you might be the only thing standing between him and getting sent somewhere I can't watch out for him anymore. Emery's eyes went past her, toward the run, toward the dog lying pressed against the fence, watching him with an intensity that made something in Emery's chest ache in a way he had no name for. I don't have an address, he said, like it was a confession, the kind of sentence he'd learned to say fast, before anyone could react to it. I don't have anything you'd need for paperwork. I sleep in a truck behind the park, that's the whole of it. Most places stop listening the second I say that part. I'm not asking about paperwork yet, Lena said. I'm asking if you'll walk through the gate. It took him a long moment. Long enough that Lena thought he might turn and go back to whatever quiet, careful life he'd built for himself outside this fence, a life with no complications in it, no dogs, no strangers with clipboards asking questions his memory couldn't answer. Then he nodded, once, and stepped through the gate, the first time in 3 weeks he'd been on the shelter's side of it, and Whistle came up off the ground so fast the chain of his tags rang out across the whole yard, a bright, ordinary sound that neither of the humans standing there quite knew how to react to. Emery stopped a few feet from the run and just stood there a moment, hands loose at his sides, looking at the dog looking at him. Whistle didn't jump, didn't bark. He pressed himself as close to the fence as the wire allowed, and waited, the way he'd been waiting 3 weeks, like the last stretch of ground between them was the only part of this whole strange arrangement he'd ever had any doubt about. Emery took one step closer, then another, and by the third step his legs had carried him further into the shelter yard than they had in 3 years of walking past its fence. That evening, back at her desk, Lena opened the folder she'd started 3 weeks ago and added a single line under the log of the day's incident, the kind of note she usually reserved for things she couldn't yet prove, but couldn't stop thinking about either. Who is this dog waiting for, and did that person just walk through our gate? The supervised interaction room was smaller than Emery expected. A bare space with a rubber floor, a bench along one wall, and a camera mounted in the corner that he tried and failed not to notice. Lena explained it, the way she explained most things now, plainly, without dressing it up. They needed data before Friday, something to put in front of Halsey that wasn't just a hunch, and the cleanest way to get it was to watch what happened when Emery and Whistle were given a room and left mostly alone in it. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "Sit if you want. Stand if you want. Just be yourself, and let him be himself. I'll be right outside the glass." Emery sat on the bench. His hands were folded in his lap, the way he sat at the VA clinic, the posture of a man used to waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. He glanced once at the camera in the corner, then made himself stop looking at it, because looking at it only reminded him how much of this moment was going to be recorded and judged by people who had never once watched him do anything but forget things. They brought Whistle in on a loose lead and let it drop the moment the door shut. The dog didn't rush him. That surprised Lena, watching through the observation glass with her pen hovering over the evaluation form. She'd expected the frantic, joyful chaos she'd have gotten from half the dogs in the shelter, given the same setup. Instead, Whistle crossed the room at a slow, deliberate walk, the walk of an animal who already knew exactly where he was going and saw no reason to hurry getting there. He stopped in front of Emery, sat, and then, with a precision that made the pen in Lena's hand go still, he lowered his head and pressed it, not against Emery's leg, not into his lap the way a dog seeking comfort would, but down and slightly to the side, into the exact angle where a hand resting on a bent knee would naturally fall. He held the position, waiting. It wasn't affection-seeking. It was a cue, a trained position, offered the way a dog offers a command it's been taught, muscle memory older than the years Whistle had spent in any kennel. Emery's hand moved before he told it to. It came up off his knee, found the crown of the dog's head, and slid without hesitation to a spot just behind the left ear. The same spot, the same pressure, thumb settling into a small, slow circle, two fingers curling under where the fur went short, and Emery watched his own hand do it like he was watching it happen to somebody else's arm. He made a sound, not a word, just breath, pushed out too fast, the sound a man makes when the ground moves slightly under a chair he thought was steady. His hand kept moving. Whistle's whole body had gone loose and heavy against his leg, eyes half closed, and Emery sat there with his palm doing something his mind had no memory of teaching it, his heart slamming in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying certainty that some part of him, some room in him he hadn't known was locked, had just for a second opened. "I don't," he started, and stopped, tried again. "I don't know why I know how to do this." He wasn't talking to the dog. He wasn't sure who he was talking to. His hand didn't stop moving. It kept finding the same small circle, over and over, like it had done this so many times once that stopping now would have taken more effort than continuing. "I don't understand," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. I don't remember you. I don't remember any of this, but my hand." He looked down at his own fingers, still working the exact same pressure they'd apparently found 1,000 times before in a life he had no access to anymore. And something in his face cracked open that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with grief he didn't yet have a shape for. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was closer to the feeling of standing in a house you'd been told was a stranger's and realizing, room by room, that you already knew where every switch on the wall was, that your hand reached for the light before your eyes had even adjusted to the dark. Whistle didn't move, didn't need reassurance, didn't whine, didn't do any of the things a dog does when it senses distress in the person it loves. He simply stayed, head heavy under Emery's palm, patient in the way of an animal that has waited far longer than 3 weeks for exactly this, the way an animal waits when it has already decided, long before the human catches up, that the waiting is going to be worth it. Emery's other hand came up too, hovering a moment before it settled flat along the dog's back, and he sat there like that a while, both hands finally doing something they seemed to have been aching to do for longer than he had any way of measuring. His breathing slowed. His shoulders, which had been drawn up tight since he'd walked into the room, dropped an inch, then another. Whatever this was, his body had clearly decided it was safe long before his mind had caught up enough to agree. On the other side of the glass, Lena had stopped writing entirely. The evaluation form sat forgotten on her knee, half a page of behavioral notes that suddenly felt like the least important thing in the room. She'd come into this job because she was good at reading animals, reading the things they couldn't say out loud, the tension in a shoulder, the set of ears, the difference between a growl that meant fear and a growl that meant don't. She had never, in 4 years, watched a dog perform a trained cue on a man who swore he'd never trained him, and watched that man's body answer back in a language his mind had lost the words for. This wasn't a stray latching onto kindness. This wasn't loneliness finding loneliness. This was two creatures who had known each other once, a long time ago, in a life that only one of them still carried whole, and watching it happen felt, to Lena, less like observing a behavioral evaluation, and more like standing outside a door she had no right to be listening at, except that someone had asked her to be there for exactly this reason. She set the clipboard down on the little shelf below the glass, still holding the pen but no longer writing, and thought about the worn leather tag under Whistle's collar, the few scratched letters she couldn't read, and the training program the shelter had once run in partnership with a veterans outreach group, a program she'd only ever seen referenced once, in passing, in an old staff meeting note about a facility budget cut years back. She hadn't thought about that note in over a year. It came back to her now whole, unbidden, the way important things sometimes do right when you need them, arriving with a clarity that made her wonder how she'd managed to forget it in the first place. She thought, too, about every other dog she'd watched come through this shelter believing, in whatever way a dog believes things, that the person who'd once loved them simply hadn't come back yet. Most of those dogs eventually stopped watching the gate. Whistle never had. 3 weeks of fence-line vigilance, and not once had his attention wavered toward anyone else, not a volunteer, not a familiar staff member, not even food, only ever the one shape moving along the sidewalk outside, over and over, like the shape itself was the only proof he needed that waiting still made sense. She didn't have proof of anything yet, but she had enough now to know where to look for it, and enough to know she wasn't going to wait until morning to start looking. Through the glass, Emery's hand was still moving in that same small circle, over and over, like it had finally been given permission to remember the one thing his mind couldn't hold on to anymore. Lena picked the clipboard back up, tucked it under her arm without finishing the form, and walked straight for the records building. Behind her, neither Emery nor the dog moved to let go. The records room hadn't been touched in what smelled like years, a windowless back office off the main building, shelves of bankers' boxes stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled in handwriting Lena didn't recognize, some of them not labeled at all. She'd worked at the shelter 3 years before she even learned this room existed, tucked behind a supply closet nobody used since the new supply closet went in. She knew what she was looking for, more or less, a training program, veterans, a partnership that had ended before her time, one she'd only ever heard mentioned once, by an older volunteer who'd since moved away, in the kind of offhand comment people make about things that used to exist and don't anymore. Lena had filed it away without thinking much of it. Now she was on her knees on a concrete floor, with a flashlight between her teeth, working through boxes marked programs, archived in a hand gone brittle with age. She found it in the 4th box. A thin folder, the cardboard gone soft at the corners, a rubber stamp across the front in faded red ink, program discontinued. Inside, a stack of intake forms and training logs from a partnership between the shelter and a veterans outreach organization, a therapy dog training initiative that had run for 2 years before funding dried up and the organization folded. She flipped through log sheets with dates 6 years back, names she didn't recognize, dogs she'd never heard of. And then, 3 pages in, a training roster with 2 names listed side by side under the header Volunteer Co-Trainers, Emery Falk, Ray Kowalski. Her hands went cold and her pulse jumped into her throat. She kept reading. The intake sheets sketched the shape of it well enough on their own. Veteran volunteers matched with shelter dogs, trained toward placement with other veterans, grounding cues built for the middle of a spiral. One of the training logs described exactly the kind of cue she'd watched Emery perform without knowing he knew it. A hand placed at a precise point behind the ear, steady pressure, meant to interrupt a panic response and pull a person's attention back into their own body. The log noted, in a different trainer's careful print, that the cue had taken the two men 11 sessions to teach reliably, and that the dog assigned to it had picked up the position faster than expected, almost as if he understood the point of it. The dog assigned to that particular placement, trained across those 11 sessions by co-trainers Falk and Kowalski for a veteran identified in the file only by initials, a man who was not Emery and was not Ray, was named, in careful blue ink at the top of the intake sheet, Whistle. Lena sat back against a box, the folder open across her knees, and felt the room tilt slightly. She kept reading, because there was more, and because some cold, careful part of her needed all of it before she let herself feel anything about any of it. There was a note, 3 pages further in, about the veteran the dog had originally been placed with, a man who had, according to a brief and clinical line in the file, transferred to a residential care facility out of state less than a year after placement, health complications unrelated to his service. The program had reassigned Whistle back into general training rotation rather than adoption, on the theory he might be placed again. He never was. And then, further still, a final entry, dated almost 2 years after the last training log, added in a different pen, a different hand, an administrative note, brief and procedural, the kind of sentence written by someone closing out a file rather than telling a story. Program lead R. Kowalski deceased. Program formally discontinued. Dog Whistle returned to shelter intake. No next of kin claim filed. File closed. No next of kin, no claim. A dog trained to hold a grieving man together, passed from one broken circumstance to another, left behind by the death of the man who'd run the program that gave him his purpose, filtered quietly back into the shelter system, with nobody left who remembered why he mattered. Lena sat very still for a long moment. She thought about the leather tag with its worn-away letters, a curve, the tail of what might have been a Y, and wondered, with a small ache she hadn't expected, whether it had once spelled a name that belonged to a man who wasn't in this room to answer for it anymore. She held the tag up next to Ray Kowalski's signature on the log. The curve, the short tail that could have been a Y, close enough to the K and the loop of Kowalski's L to stop her breath, close enough to call it a match. She thought about Emery, sitting on that bench an hour ago, his hand moving in a pattern his mind had no record of, insisting he'd never trained a dog in his life. He hadn't been lying. He genuinely didn't remember. The injury had taken the years clean, the way a flood takes a house, foundation still there, walls gone, whole rooms simply washed out to sea, without so much as a mark on the doorframe to say they'd once existed. But his hands remembered. His hands had been in that room 6 years ago, teaching this exact dog this exact motion, alongside a friend who was gone now too, and no amount of forgetting had managed to reach down into muscle and undo it. Whatever had broken in Emery, it had broken above that, in the part of him that filed things into words and dates and could name them later. Beneath it, in whatever part of a person holds the shape of emotion without needing to know why, nothing had broken at all. She thought about Ray Kowalski's name, sitting there in blue ink next to Emery's, and wondered whether Emery even remembered that he'd had a friend by that name, whether that memory had gone the way of the coffee he forgot he'd drunk 20 minutes earlier, or whether it lived somewhere further back, in the part of him the blast hadn't reached. There was no way to know from a file, only one way to find out. She closed the folder, careful with the soft, brittle cardboard, and sat with it a moment longer than she needed to, long enough to feel the weight of what she was about to walk out of this room carrying, and to understand that once she put this folder in front of Emery Falk, there would be no way to take it back or soften what it was going to cost him to see it. Then she stood, tucked the folder under her arm, and made herself walk toward the door, instead of standing there a while longer working up the nerve. Waiting wouldn't make the folder lighter. It would only mean Whistle spent one more night not knowing why a stranger's hand had felt like coming home, and it would mean Emery spent one more night not knowing why his own hands kept telling him a story his mind refused to remember. Emery was sitting on the low concrete wall outside the fence when Lena found him, the folder heavy under her arm, a single photograph tucked loose inside its cover, one that had slid out of the training log when she'd lifted it, small and square, a Polaroid gone soft with age. She'd almost missed it, caught between two pages, and the moment she'd seen what was on it, she'd known she couldn't wait until morning to bring it to him. "Can I sit?" she asked. He nodded, shifted a little, made room without really needing to. Whistle was lying on the shelter side of the fence, close as always, watching them both with the patient attention of an animal who had learned, somewhere in whatever life he'd lived before this one, that important things happened slowly and were worth waiting for. Lena didn't lead with the folder. She led with the photograph, holding it out flat on her palm. "I found this in an old file. I think it's yours." Emery took it carefully, the way you'd take something you weren't sure would survive the handling. Two young men in fatigues, a chain-link fence behind them, a dog between their legs with its face slightly blurred, caught mid-turn. It was the same photograph, or nearly. He had one almost exactly like it, folded into a tin under the passenger seat of his truck, the one he took out sometimes and looked at without understanding why he'd kept it. "That's," he stopped, looked closer. "I have this. I have one like this." "You're one of the men in it," Lena said gently. "So is a man named Ray Kowalski. You two trained dogs together 6 years ago. This dog, Whistle. There was a program here, veterans training service dogs for other veterans. You and Ray were the trainers." Emery's eyes stayed on the photograph. His jaw was tight, the muscle working slow under the skin. "I don't remember a program," he said. "I don't remember training anything. I believe you." Lena kept her voice even, unhurried. "But I think some of it's still in you. The way your hand knew exactly where to go, today, in that room. That's not something people just do by accident. That's trained, taught, and taught deep enough that even 6 years and—" She hesitated, not sure how much to say at once, then decided he deserved all of it. "Even an injury that took a lot from you, it didn't reach that. It's still there, in your hands, if not anywhere else." "Ray," Emery said. He said the name slowly, testing its weight, the way you'd test ice before putting your full weight on it. "Ray Kowalski," he said it again, and something under the name gave way. It didn't come back to him all at once, and it didn't come back in order. Lena watched it arrive the way she imagined water finding cracks in old concrete, seeping in wherever there was a way through. "A voice first," he said, low and rough, laughing at something. A joke about coffee that never stopped being funny no matter how many times he heard it. Not the joke itself, just the shape of laughing at it, over and over, patient every single time. "He never got tired of me asking the same thing twice," Emery said, and his voice had gone thin, stretched over something underneath it. "I'd ask him something, forget I asked, ask again, even back then, before all this got worse. I'd lose things, little things, and he never once looked at me like it was a burden. He'd just answer again, same tone every time, like it was the first time I'd asked." He looked up, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't seem to notice or care. "He died," Emery said. "It wasn't a question. That's why the program ended. That's why the dog—" He looked down at Whistle, who had pressed himself against the fence as close as the chain link allowed, watching Emery's face with an intensity that had nothing casual in it. "That's why he was alone." "I think so," Lena said quietly. "The file just says program lead deceased. It doesn't say much else." Emery sat with that for a long moment, the photograph trembling slightly in his hand, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something Lena almost didn't catch. "After he died, I don't remember the funeral. I don't know if I went. I don't remember most of that year at all, if I'm honest. It's mostly just gaps. But I remember deciding something. I don't remember deciding it exactly. It's more like I can feel the shape of a decision I must have made, even though I can't remember making it, that I wasn't going to let anyone else get close enough to matter. Because Ray was the only person who never got tired of my mind falling apart in front of him, and I was terrified of doing that to somebody else, or something else." His eyes went to the dog. "I was scared I'd forget him too. Whoever came next. I was scared I'd let something in and then just lose it. The way I lose everything now. And it would be my fault, not the injuries. Mine, for letting it in at all." He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, an unpracticed, almost embarrassed motion, like crying was a skill he hadn't used in a long time and had forgotten how to do gracefully. "That's the fear," he said. "That's the actual fear. Not that I'll forget." That I'll make something love me and then forget it, and it'll be left holding all of it alone, the way—" He stopped, looked at Whistle, didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. Lena didn't say anything right away. She let the silence sit there, because some silences needed room, and this was one of them. She thought about the file in her lap, about a program lead who never got a chance to be anything but a closing line in a discontinued folder, and about a dog who had spent 6 years apparently doing what Ray Kowalski could no longer do, waiting out every gap in Emery's memory without once treating it like a burden. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "I don't think Whistle's been holding it alone. I think that's the whole point of what's been happening at that fence for 3 weeks. He found you before you found him. Whatever's broken in your memory, it clearly isn't broken in whatever part of you he can still recognize." Emery looked down at his hands again, the same hands that had known exactly where to rest on the dog's head before his mind caught up to why, and something in his face shifted, not resolved, not healed, but loosened slightly, the way a knot loosens the first time someone finally finds the right end to pull. He reached through the fence again, without thinking about it this time, and Whistle leaned into it the same way he had every time before, like the two of them had already agreed on this particular language and were only now catching the humans around them up to speed. "I don't know how to do this," Emery said quietly. "Let something matter again. I've spent a long time making sure nothing could. Every time I thought about letting anyone in, all I could see was a version of myself 6 months later forgetting their name, forgetting a promise, forgetting the reason they mattered in the first place. It seemed kinder to just not start." "And now?" Lena asked. "Now there's a dog who apparently decided a long time ago that I was worth waiting for, whether I remembered him or not," Emery said. "I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to be worth what he's already decided about me." "Maybe you don't have to figure that out today," Lena said. "Maybe you just let him keep deciding it, and you catch up when you can." It was the shelter's assistant director who broke the moment, appearing in the doorway of the intake building, and calling Lena's name with the particular urgency of someone who'd been sent to fetch her. "Lena, sorry to interrupt. Policy office wants to see you, about the Falk adoption file." Lena stood, brushing gravel dust from her knees, and looked back at Emery, who was still sitting with the photograph held loose in his hands, Whistle's head now resting through the gap in the fence against his knee, both of them quiet in the fading light. "I'll be right back," she said. She wasn't sure, walking toward the intake building, whether that was entirely true. Deputy Warden Halsey had the adoption file open on the desk in front of her, and Lena could tell from the set of her shoulders, before either of them said a word, that the answer had already been decided, somewhere upstream of this room. "I've read your notes," Halsey said. "I appreciate the thoroughness, but Mr. Falk doesn't have a fixed address, no verifiable income, no permanent housing status. Policy requires proof of stable residence for adoption of any animal flagged with a behavioral history, and this dog has 2 warning snap incidents on record this week alone. He didn't bite anyone," he warned. "There's a difference and you know it. I know the difference. The paperwork doesn't." Halsey rubbed at her eyes, and for a moment she looked less like an obstacle and more like a tired woman at the end of a long week. "I'm not trying to be cruel here. If this dog goes to someone who can't provide stability and something happens, that's a failure we could have prevented by following the process that exists for exactly this reason." Lena had known this argument was coming, and it still landed somewhere it hurt. Because Halsey wasn't wrong about the reasoning. The policy existed because sometimes it protected animals from exactly the situation she was describing. It just wasn't built for a situation like this one. "Then let me show you why this isn't that situation," Lena said, and opened her laptop on the corner of Halsey's desk. She played the footage, 3 nights of Whistle at the fence, silent and still, waiting for a man who wasn't calling him, wasn't feeding him, wasn't doing anything but walking past on a schedule that had nothing to do with the dog at all. She laid the old training file on the desk, open to the page with 2 names side by side, under volunteer co-trainers, and the closing note about a program lead who had died, and a dog left with no next of kin. "This isn't a stray who got lucky finding a soft touch," Lena said. This is a dog trained specifically to anchor a person in crisis, who lost the man who ran that program, and who somehow found the other trainer 3 years later on a sidewalk he had no reason to be walking down. That's not a behavioral risk. That's the most stable bond I've seen in 4 years working here. It's just not stable in a way our forms know how to measure. Halsey was quiet a long moment, turning the worn leather tag over in her fingers. Lena had brought that too, laid it beside the training file, where the faint curve of an old letter almost matched the handwriting on the intake sheet. Almost enough to believe. Not quite enough to prove, not on paper, not in a way that would hold up if anyone above Halsey ever asked her to justify the exception. "I can't approve this on my own authority," Halsey said finally. "An exception to a fixed address requirement has to go through the full adoption board. I can put it in front of them. I can't promise what they'll decide. Then let them watch the footage. Let them see what I saw." Halsey looked at her for a moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. Not agreement exactly, but the give of someone asked, for once, to consider what a rule might also be preventing. "I'll request an emergency session," she said. 2 days if I push it. No guarantees." 2 days later, the adoption board's meeting room sat washed in the low gold light of late afternoon, sun angling sideways through the blinds. Lena had spent both of those days on the phone, calling the Veterans Outreach Organization that no longer technically existed, but still had a director reachable by email, confirming Ray Kowalski's service dates against the training file, getting one brief, startled conversation with a former neighbor who remembered Emery as quiet, always kind to the dog next door, never made a bit of trouble. None of it made it into the room with the same weight it had taken to gather it. It just sat there, folded into a stack of paper, the visible tip of 2 days most of the board would never know had happened. Emery sat in a chair near the wall, whistle lying across his feet, both of them still in the particular way they'd learned to be still together. He didn't say much. He just sat with his hand resting on the dog's back, and waited the way he'd learned to wait for most things now, without much hope, but without leaving either. Halsey sat at the head of the table with the full file open in front of her, the laptop already cued to the footage. She'd read every page of it twice. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Everyone at that table had read the file and watched the footage, and was sitting with the particular silence that comes right before a decision that matters gets made. Halsey opened the folder to the final page, picked up a pen, and did not sign it yet. The pen came down, and the signature was short. Halsey's shoulders dropped an inch, and someone by the door laughed under their breath, quiet and relieved. Halsey slid the approved file across the table without a speech to go with it, just a small nod toward Emery that said more than a speech would have. Whistle was on his feet before anyone told him what had happened, tail going, pressed hard against Emery's legs like he already understood. Out in the yard afterward, in the last warm light of the day, Emery knelt down and looped a new tag around Whistle's collar, his hands steady in a way they hadn't been in a very long time. He said the name out loud once, quiet, testing it, and it came easy, no searching, no gap where the memory should be. His hand had known it all along, his mouth just needed to catch up. For the first time in years, Emery Falk wasn't afraid of what he might forget. Some things, it turned out, didn't need his memory to hold on to them. They just needed somewhere warm to rest, and Whistle had already found the spot.